All right, thanks for coming to this session and listening to this very oddly recorded talk. Um, the title here is Neoliberalism, Common Assumptions in a Polarized Age. Maybe an ambitious title, but I'm hoping you'll find it interesting. What I want to do today is a kind of, I suppose it's a big thought, big picture thought experiment, by which I mean it's not really, this isn't an archivally based research project, but it comes out of other archivally based research projects I've done, most recently, including my two most recent books, an edited collection on the Omnibus Bill of 1969, and my own contribution there, which was really about how a kind of new morality of the self, a morality rooted in the individual, was part of the logic behind those changes. And then as well, my book on kind of the afterlife of William Lyon Mackenzie King, and in particular, Canadians' approach to William Lyon Mackenzie King after he died. So I'm coming out of those works, but I want to offer you a kind of bigger picture idea here. And in particular, what I want to do is place neoliberalism, the way we talk about neoliberalism in the academy, into a wider cultural and intellectual context. I want to suggest to you that the way we talk about it isn't quite right, and that there's perhaps a more interesting and more useful way of seeing neoliberalism's connection to other things that are happening at the same time over the history of Canada and the Western world from the 1970s onwards, even a little bit before the 1970s, I think. Now, of course, the definition of neoliberalism that we usually use, I'm sure you're all quite familiar with. This is the story which talks about neoliberalism being associated with, of course, Reagan and Thatcher, being promoted from even before that time by think tanks like the Mount Pelerin Society, and then moving onwards to other kinds of think tanks. These ideas that are pushed across the United States, Canada, Britain, in particular ideas about private property, the importance of free trade, deregulating markets, really the kind of celebration of the market, and especially of the individual actors within that market as the kind of the sine qua non of really economic life, if not life in general. There's a real emphasis here, of course, on individual choice. The language of choice matters so much, and autonomy. That's really important. And of course, it's often been associated with kind of social fragmentation, right, and inhibiting claims to social solidarity, the welfare state. There's a lot of criticisms of neoliberalism. In fact, that's usually what most of the literature tends to focus on. Okay, what I want to say, though, is that I think the cultural logic that neoliberalism depends on, that is the kind of its appeal to people who wouldn't automatically benefit from it. I think that cultural logic was used by many different actors in the post-war and really period, over the second half of the 20th century, including, and I would say even especially, those on the left. In particular, I want to highlight the deregulating logic of choice and individual autonomy. These phrases, these concepts, which are pretty important to neoliberalism, are also important in a whole host of social movements and social and cultural developments in the second half of the 20th century, especially after the 1960s. All right, so if you have neoliberalism here in the middle of the Venn diagram, I want to suggest that we could see it in the context of things like the rights revolution, with which it shares a certain number of basic principles. You could also see it in the context of a whole host of movements around moral and sexual deregulation. And as well as it also shares a kind of language and series of assumptions with a whole kind of widespread kinds of movements, all of which rely on these ideas of experience and individual experience or group experience as a kind of truth, appeals to authenticity as a kind of, again, a kind of arbiter of truth and ultimate power, and of course the kind of self-esteem movements and a whole host of movements associated with the therapeutic revolution over the course of the second half of the 20th century. In fact, what I would suggest is actually, I'm going to use, as my title does, a kind of neologism here, which is, we could call these things in a different Venn diagram, really meoliberalism, that's a better way of understanding the interactions between all of these different processes, movements, cultural phenomena. Okay, by neoliberalism, what I mean is a kind of a series of ideas which becomes incredibly powerful and popular over the second half of the 20th century. It has roots in both kind of Lockean and Rousseauian ideas of individual liberalism, that is the kind of Lockean liberalism you might associate with property rights, but also the Rousseauian liberalism, which becomes incredibly powerful in the second half of the 20th century, that's associated with kind of a skepticism of civilization, as Rousseau would have put it, social obligation, the state, and sees those kinds of obligations as intrinsically limiting the individual. So there's a kind of radical ethic of individual autonomy that's suspicious of social action, social infringement, and state interference and infringement upon the individual. And it prizes authenticity, individual experience above all else, and sees those as kind of the ultimate aspects of any kind of society that needs to value these particular ideas. So where can we see it at work? I've given you some hints in the Venn diagram. Let's go through it in a bit more detail. The rights revolution, of course, draws on that of course takes off over the second half of the 20th century, but especially after in Canada, especially after the 1960s. Of course, has roots in Enlightenment ideas of what was called in the 18th century the rights of man, which was radically expanded even in the 18th century to the rights of women, of course, in the Haitian Revolution beyond kind of racially challenging assumptions about the rights of man. And so you can trace a kind of long-term history of the rights revolution, but it's really in the second half of the 20th century that these ideas about individual rights, about human rights, become encoded and institutionalized in a whole series of forms in Canada, from the Ontario government's 1962 Human Rights Code through to the spreading of other provincial human rights codes, to Diefenbaker's Bill of Rights, but of course fundamentally in 1982 when these ideas are enshrined, at least in part, in the Charter. What I want to suggest here is that we can see in the rights revolution some of the logic about individual choice and radical individual autonomy that is part of this broader movement of what I would say is neoliberalism, a kind of asserting individual autonomy against restrictions from whether they become from the society or the state, and seeing in those restrictions potential for, of course, discrimination, mistreatment, and all these other kinds of infringements upon the individual. And of course, in this context, in some ways, social obligation, social pressure becomes associated with conformity, with discrimination, and of course, potential for real oppression. So that's one area which I think there's a kind of shared language with neoliberalism in this bigger thing of neoliberalism. I would also say that this broad series of movements towards moral and sexual deregulation that happened in the second half of the 20th century also matter. This is really, I would say, the other kinds of deregulation that we need to understand alongside neoliberal deregulation. And these were the attempts to limit state and social and religious infringements upon individual freedoms, individual freedom to make choices in one's moral and sexual lives. And of course, this operates, of course, on the same principle of this kind of suspicion about state and social infringement or any kind of suggestion that these individual choices can be limited. And again, here you see the same kind of ethic of individual autonomy at work. A few examples. Of course, I'm thinking most specifically of divorce reform, then the introduction of no-fault divorce beginning in 1968, of course, allowing for no-fault divorce after 3 years. By the mid-'80s, this is changing to just 1 year. This is, although some scholars have worked on this is really probably one of the most important social transformations in over the last third of the 20th century that profoundly changes family life, social life in a whole host of ways. And much of the rhetoric behind this, much of the rationale behind it, becomes from an assumption that individuals ought to have choice in these kinds of situations, and diminishing the power of these institutions that had previously been considered so sacrosanct, family and marriage. Of course, You can see the same kinds of process of sexual and moral deregulation in the fight for same-sex rights. Not beginning, but obviously symbolized by the Omnibus Bill reforms in 1969 that partially decriminalized homosexuality, and then in the kind of the rise of activism afterwards to take on all those areas that weren't decriminalized, to push for, in fact, individual rights and freedom from discrimination. The line, of course, that Trudeau uses in talking about the changes, talking about the state having no business in the bedrooms of the nation. This, of course, beautifully encapsulates the rhetoric and the idea of individual choice limiting state power. Of course, the same kinds of ideas, the same kinds of powerful rhetoric and ideas underpin the movement around and debates around abortion. Again, with the limited reforms of 1969, and then the demands for increased access to abortion in the years after that, leading up to, of course, the Morgenthaler decision in 1988. And of course, it doesn't end there, with continued activism afterwards. But again, I'd note here how important the rhetoric of choice becomes here, of individual choice, individual autonomy. That's ultimately what the Supreme Court decision rests on. And of course, it's so pervasive and so powerful that, in fact, the opposition to abortion itself often sometimes becomes to use the language of choice itself in trying to make its argument. So this notion of individual autonomy, really important to these movements of social and sexual deregulation in the latter stages of the 20th century. Okay. Thirdly, I also want to talk about this category that you could roughly call kind of authenticity or recognition-based movements, and that is a series of movements that make their claims to power based on the notions of authenticity, that whether it's an individual or a group experience that's rooted in their self really matters profoundly. It matters as a kind of emotional truth, right? And here you can find individual points of this or group parts of this, whether it's kind of Rousseau or Herder, whether the individual carries that group experience within themselves. And a lot of these movements, both social and then intellectual, come to claim, this idea becomes to have a great deal of power, that to deny the truth of an identity claim to someone who sees himself in a certain way is to deny the self. And that this becomes, especially by the end of the 20th century into the 21st century, a kind of harm, right? So these ideas of authenticity and recognition come to have incredibly powerful resonance. I'm going to throw up here a few different examples, but there are many more that you could have here. Anything from child-centered parenting education movements, right? This kind of to transform education and parenting advice in these years. Movements which emphasize that we need to recognize the inner experience of the child, whether it's in the family or in schools. And of course, these are all about prizing the inner authenticity of the child, their truth, their experience, and diminishing kind of family, social, and other kinds of authority over those, educational teaching authority, and kind of recognizing what is already there within the child. Of course, these ideas of authenticity, of recognition, are intrinsic to the series of identity politics movements which transform Canada and the modern West, especially in the 1980s, well, 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. In particular, the ideas of that grow out of the multiculturalism, policy that the Trudeau government announces in 1971, and of course, as it goes on to shape how Canadians talk about multiculturalism, about culture, and again, this idea that recognizing the value of cultures, recognizing the intrinsic value of cultures, regardless of where one comes, becomes so powerful in these ideas, right? So there are inner truths in different cultural experience. There's also, of course, the therapeutic revolution, whether it's very beginning early on in some kinds of the spread of Freudian ideas, but then spreading to things like marriage counseling, pop psychology, and especially in these years in the 1970s, 1980s. I cover this quite a bit in my Unbuttoned book. This idea that you could, if you want to look for real social truths, real truths, that you need to look within the self, right? This idea comes to having real, incredibly powerful resonance. And other scholars have talked about the transition over really the whole course of the 20th century from a kind of character-based vision of the individual, where someone needs to be kind of more rooted in a Christian culture, where the individual needs to be restrained, disciplined, holding in the self, the taint of self, to, in fact, a kind of more expressive individualism focused on personality that needs to just be guided and let to open up. Again, identifying and allowing the truth of that inner authentic experience to come out. One of the fun ways in which you can see all these things working together is, of course, the self-esteem movement, which just takes off in the 1970s, 1980s. It has a fascinating history, which others have covered, but it has a fascinating history also in part because you can see here the links between neoliberalism and what I'm calling meoliberalism. And that is the way in which the self-esteem movement, this idea that, that people need to value people's self-esteem, really shore that up. In fact, that much of the foundation of those ideas came from Nathaniel Branden, this kind of devotee and in fact lover of Ayn Rand, who comes to be so influential as a kind of thinker and founding that self-esteem movement. Of course, Ayn Rand's ideas about the radical individualism need no overall emphasis here. But of course, it's also another one of Rand's devotees, Alan Greenspan, who goes into to head up the Federal Reserve and follow on those kinds of neoliberal policies there. Overall here, I think what you should see here is there's an emphasis on, of course, individual truth against social institutions, authorities, and tradition. The individual authenticity of the individual or the group matters more than society, institution, authority, tradition. So let's put this all together. What I'm suggesting here is, of course, it can be somewhat limited. I can just offer correlations. I'm not talking about echoes and similarities in the use of language. But I really do want to draw attention to the shared language and logic between neoliberalism and these other powerful social movements that we would normally study in isolation. And I would suggest that the way we come at thinking about neoliberalism in a kind of ideological fashion prevents us from seeing this shared language. In fact, I would say that this radical ethic of individual autonomy pervaded all these different ideas, from identity politics to therapeutic culture to education and parenting advice to social and sexual moral deregulation, of course, to divorce reform and changing ideas of family. And of course, that it also shares these ideas with the radical ethic of individual autonomy and choice that we associate with neoliberalism. So I would say that these represent a kind of shared ideascape of neoliberalism, that although neoliberalism, and we could see their desire to free up markets, the belief in choice, suspicion of the state, we could see in which they shared a lot in common and shared a kind of language with those they would seemingly otherwise have been seen as their ideological enemies or adversaries. And in fact, because like activists calling for the deregulation of sex lives, access to abortion, promoting multiculturalism, the self-esteem movement, that they shared the logic in many senses of Ayn Rand and the neoliberal reformers. Okay, clearly what I'm offering is a kind of lumping, not splitting approach. I'm not denying that there are clear differences, clear categories of the way in which different people, different groups use these ideas. But it seems really important that we think about not just the divisions between these different groups and movements, but the way in which they relied and drew upon a shared language, a shared kind of ideascape, right? And we need to really think about what this is and why this matters. And I'm trying to give this a tentative name, which I'm calling neoliberalism. Okay, thank you.